Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò, for the beginning of a new fascinating series that has been conceived by my two dear friends, Grazia D'Annunzio and Eugenia Paulicelli, that I'm going to introduce to you in a very short time. There are a few free chairs every now and then, not that one that is for me. There is one here and a few in the middle if you want to take a seat. So you'll be comfortable and fully enjoy tonight's performance. Eugenia and Grazia are going to talk more about the series, what inspired it, what's cooking for the future. And so I have a very easy task, that is to introduce two very dear friends. And they, in turn, they will introduce their guest tonight. Grazia D'Annunzio, right there, was the deputy editor of Vogue Italia in 19...
Thank you.
Grazia already has a following. Glad to see that. She was the deputy editor of Vogue Italia in 1988, and in 1992 she launched the Italian version of Glamour. Since 1995, she has become a New Yorker and works for the Condé Nast Group. Her heart obviously beats stronger for Vogue, L'Uomo Vogue, and Architectural Digest. But Grazia also has a degree in classics from the University of Pavia, and where she studied Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. She's currently learning Yiddish. So that's...
Shalom Aleichem.
Fashion, but not only fashion. She was also the author very recently of an article published in the New York Times Style magazine that at that time was still directed by Stefano Tonchi on Gabriele D'Annunzio, the Randy Dandy. It's a fantastic short article that will introduce you to her ancestor, and we happen to have an exhibit dedicated to D'Annunzio upstairs, so take a look at it. On many levels, he was the inventor and the creator of divismo, of the new concept of fashion. He was an intellectual that was very concerned with fashion and style, and some of the things we have upstairs are a clear proof of that nothing was random in his house, like from salt holders to gowns to bathrobes. Everything was designed to till the specific detail by him. So it's a beautiful complement to our evening, the exhibit that we have upstairs, so take a look at it. And then here to my right, you have Eugenia Paulicelli, who is a professor and the co-director of the Concentration in Fashion Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's currently working on two book-length projects on fashion and cinema and fashion and early modern Italian literature. Her previous publications include Fashion Under Fascism, Beyond the Black Shirt, 2004. Now, did they have skirts? Your other interest is gender, so it would also work with the black skirt. And then Moda e Moderno, dal Medioevo al Rinascimento, Roma 2006, The Fabric of Cultures, Fashion, Identity and Globalization, and she's the co-editor of Un anno in Italia, Cinema, Costume e Moda. And this said, as I said, I had the easiest task of all, and it's a great pleasure to welcome our guests for the beginning of our series, Addressing Style, Conversations on the Visual Arts. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. I am particularly delighted to be here tonight in such good company and embarking on a new project with an old friend and esteemed colleague such as Stefano Albertini, another Italianista like me. He was responsible, in fact, for my encounter with Grazia D'Annunzio. I met Grazia on the occasion of the show I curated at James Gallery, the CUNY Graduate Center last spring on fashion and film, and about which she produced a video for Vogue. After an hour of lovely conversation over lunch at the Morgan Library, we both immediately knew that we could work on something together. Tonight is indeed the first result of this collaboration with Stefano and Grazia, and with our distinguished guest, Stefano Tonchi and Harold Koda, whose work I've been admiring over the years. As a professor of Italian who has been carrying out research on fashion since the late 80s, I believe more than ever that fashion deserves the attention of academia, and even more for Italian culture and identity. Fashion calls for interdisciplinarity and collaboration to gain a fuller understanding of such a complex and transnational system and phenomenon. a huge manufacturing and culture industry, fashion has a strong impact on the shaping of gender and multifaceted identities in a constant process of becoming in space and time. Especially in the case of Italy, identity has always been linked to questions of forms, beauty, and style. Fashion, however, signifies and exercises its power through a variety of media, literature, film, photography, magazines, museums, and it is in such a light that we'll focus tonight on fashion in a globalized world and on how it is mediated through two specific institutions, museums and magazines, and on how and to what extent these two worlds intersect and interact. And now a few words on tonight's guest here.
Thank you all. Again, thank you for being here for this inaugural event of Dressing Style Conversation on the Visual Arts, and I'm proud to introduce you briefly our two guests of tonight's discussion, Fashion in the Global Age. Harold Koda has been the curator in charge of the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York since the year 2000. In this decade, he has masterminded numerous highly acclaimed shows, including Goddess, Poiret, King of Fashion, Superheroes, Model as a Muse, and American Woman. His relationship with the Costume Institute has been long, strong, and extremely prolific, and it dates back from the 70s, when Mr. Koda started his career as the exhibition assistant to the legendary Diana Vreeland, working on projects such as the Vanity Fair, Diaghilev, and the Glory of the Russian Costumes. Mr. Koda also established a long-time collaboration with the late Richard Martin, first at the Museum of FIT, where during the 80s, they put together seminal shows like Balenciaga, Jock and Mirth, and the beautiful Fashion and Surrealism. And in the 90s, when Mr. Martin became the curator in charge of the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum, Mr. Koda followed him there, and they worked closely on 12 successful shows, and among them, we would like to remember Diana Vreeland in Moderate Style, Madame Grey, and Christian Dior. Harold Koda left briefly the Costume Institute in the late 90s to study landscape architecture at Harvard, where he got a master's degree. And in these years, he was also the co-curator of the Giorgio Armani retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. He has co-authored several books, including catalogs for Met exhibitions, and he received numerous awards, including 2 special awards from the Council of Fashion Designers of America. Stefano Tonchi was named the editor-in-chief of W magazine last March, and this new position marks his return to Condé Nast, having worked as Self magazine's creative director in the mid-90s. Most recently, Mr. Tonchi was the creator and the editor-in-chief of T, the New York Times Style magazine, which he introduced in 2004. Under his leadership, T increased to 15 issues annually, expanded internationally, launched a companion website, and was nominated for multiple national magazine awards. In the 2008, T was awarded Magazine of the Year from the Society of Publication Designers. From 1998 to 2003, Mr. Tonchi was the fashion creative director of Esquire, which under his stylist leadership earned the Magazine of the Year award from the Society of Publication Designers in 2001, as well as National Magazine Award nomination for photography and design. Stefano Tonchi's career started in Italy in the 80s, where he co-founded and served as editor and art director for Western, a publication that later evolved into Emporio Armani magazine. And he eventually became the fashion director of World of Vogue. Mr. Tonchi also curated a number of exhibitions devoted to style and edited several books on the intersection of art and fashion. He was the co-author of Uniform, Order and Disorder, which was also a very successful exhibition here in New York at PS1 MoMA, and Total Living, Excess, Mainstream and the Underground in the 80s, which was an exhibition at the Pitti Palace in Florence. And most recently, he published Walter Albini and His Time. And now, join me in welcoming Harold Koda. Okay, I have a question for both of you. And since we are talking about fashion in the global age, what are the functions of museums and magazines in this global and digital age?
I would start with, because I think magazine, I'll start, I think, because magazines are actually the more, how to say, the superficial part of the equation here. Really, like the digital age have changed the way we publish magazine, the way of distribution, and the way we handle information. But still, a good magazine is a good magazine, no matter on what platform it is delivered. So what I mean here is that when what is the function of a magazine is to edit. I think more than ever, it is important to be an editor, because there is such an overload of information that our job, it become more and more important. Edit, show to our readers what we think is relevant, what they should know. I think it is about creating, and I think it's always been like that, a relationship of trust with your readers. When the editors created this, like, I think somehow one-on-one relationship with the readers, and you can, how to say, you can, if they trust you, you cannot do wrong. And that's really like something that I think is so important in making magazines. I think that's the soul of making magazines. And in that sense, I mean, the digital age has not changed the function of a magazine.
That is true, I'm sorry, because I don't know if you increased, for instance, when you were at T, having the blog and having a website, that increased the circulation of the magazine or not?
Well, I mean, the reach of the publication was much larger, I would say, on the web than on print. We had millions and millions of visitors to our website, but still it was about the people working at the magazine, how they would edit the news, how they would write the entries, and that's really like what the job is about.
Carol?
I'm not sure that in the digital age that our mission has transformed that much as a museum. Museums are, even contemporary art museums, are necessarily somewhat retrospective. Even if they're looking at contemporary culture, they're looking at it in the present. They're not really directing the future per se. One of the main reasons for the existence of these conglomerations of objects and artifacts, whether it's historical or artistic or scientific, is to preserve them and to interpret them and to have an educational function. In that regard, museums haven't changed. What we've noticed at the Met and with the Costume Institute, that where there has been a kind of global development is by having a very different platform. That is, a few years ago, we did an exhibition called Blog Mode, which we hoped would engage a different demographic than our standard one, which is really quite a large and heterogeneous group, but tends to skew between people in the ages of 25 and 65. I mean, that's sort of the Met demographic. And we wanted to get perhaps a younger demographic to begin to follow our different shows. And so this was an experiment. And so we had computers set up in the galleries, as well as the possibility of logging on the web to the Met website to participate in a way that was a running commentary on the objects in the show. We had some resistance on the part of the museum in that one of the great things about being in the proximity of an art object is that you see it in a very, very different way than its representation. And so there was this feeling that perhaps to have this virtual presentation of our exhibition and the materials in it was not going to be sufficient to the purposes, the real mission of the institution. But we were able to argue it, and we did it. What we found was that with the participation of the audience within the museum itself, was very subjective and personal. And it was like, wow, I love those shoes. Red, LOL. Those kinds of comments. What we found that was really heartening were those comments that came at, you know, you can track them, 2 a.m. from Sri Lanka or Romania, of people who were very thoughtfully looking over our selection of objects and commenting on them. And so where I do see a kind of globalization is less in the way that individual museums transform their mission, but rather that our audience has now become one with the possibility of this kind of extraordinary and expansive reach.
Yes, to both of you. Fashion is a double temporality, pastness and presentness. How do museum and magazine situate themselves between these two poles? And Stefano?
Wow. Well, I don't know so much about museum, but magazines respond to contemporary, to news and to fashion news. We usually, you know, report on what we see in the seasonal fashion shows. And those fashions are not even anymore seasonal. They're kind of monthly. It's kind of a continuous cycle of presentations and of products. I mean, even when you think about the way fashion is consumed, it's not consumed in a seasonal way anymore, but in a continuum of offers that have to be different from the one before. So we register like anything that is new. At the same time, it's the work of a magazine to put that new thing in the context of what is happening and to mirror the changes that happen in culture at large and society at large. So it's never just about the today, but it's also at the same time about the yesterday. So much also of what we see and what we live, especially in the last 20, 30 years, we were talking about this a little earlier, is about what happened in the past. And, you know, we are like now living this age of what I call the post-post, because everything has been done before. But it's the context of it that changes. So you have to look at the present and put it in a relationship with the past continuously. That's the exercise that we do every time we put together like an issue. We kind of, the work of an editor is selecting and somehow connecting the dot, connecting the present with the roots of the past.
This past season, there was a response, I think, that one saw in a lot of the different presentations of fashion designers. Oh, I'm sorry. There was a response to the extraordinary exhibition of
It is weird.
It's just not attracted to me.
No.
Is that okay?
It is okay.
There was an extraordinary exhibition, retrospective exhibition of Yves Saint Laurent. And so you saw a number of different designers of very different approaches responding to that presentation. It was so clear in their collections. But what was interesting about one particular one, and I'm not going to name him, but that what he was able to do was look at Saint Laurent in the 70s and make it contemporary and this is a word that fashion people use all the time, and they hate it, but there's nothing else that really quite covers it. There was a kind of excitement and edginess to it that he was really able to reinsert into what was a sort of classical franchise. And so I think that whether you're a magazine or a museum, one of our approaches is to take something from the past and revivify it, is to make it come alive again in a way that seems like it's very apt and relevant to your life. When I was at FIT with Richard Martin, one of the strategies we took was to take something that was very contemporary from the last season and juxtapose it with something that was a century or 2 centuries old. That what we would do is, like a newspaper, you know, everyone says the newspaper has to be about relevance and immediacy, that we would introduce something that was relevant and immediate to the general public, and then bring them back to the original roots. So that was a strategy that I've imported.
Contextualize,
Yeah.
Right.
So it's interesting because from both your answers, I mean, this double temporality really coexists within these two institutions,
And
which
you
is
can
very
see-
interesting because, you know, you don't associate immediately.
And I think it's
Magazine.
happened even more so in
Yeah.
publications in a way that it didn't 20 or 30 years ago. When we did Jocks and Nerds, I remember we could get photographs that were done 2 seasons before, and the photographers would just give them to us. They didn't require rights, because at that point, if it was published editorially, it ceased to have a life. After we did Jocks and Nerds, several publications began to go through their archive and revive the old photographs because it became attractive to them to do a timeline and say, oh, you know, the miniskirt, and this is where it came from. And then suddenly, as a not-for-profit institution, we were going back to the same photographers, and they saw the life of their archives. Many of them were not really archives, they were just accumulations.
I remember that exhibition, that I think it's one of the really great seminal exhibition, because it was the first time that actually I think an institution was looking at menswear and contextualizing with like contemporary reference and then bringing it to life, but at the same time creating like kind of a backtrack for everything that was happening. And you know, when you talk about,
it was a success,
I remember,
in a sense, when it had the endorsement of Mr. Armani. We saw 2 copies of it on his bookshelf, and we said, well, it's fed back to him. Clearly, there's a liveliness to it then.
For instance, also when you did fashion and surrealism, and we really, I lived most of my years at Vogue really studying that catalog, and the exhibition was...
well, because that was another contextualization of fashion and art in a moment that not many were doing that,
Yes,
you know.
but it's
That was
interesting-
Richard Martin.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
really saw a kind of elastic relationship between all kinds of high, low,
But that's
fine arts.
important because you know you can't contextualize the present if you don't relate it to the past. We are what we are, but we are part of what we were, and
Yeah,
that's part of it.
and it's not just about the news and the past, what is present, what is past. It's also about different arts. I think we lost for many years that idea of the art décorative as one core of experiences, and where, you know, somebody may design clothes, somebody may make the music for the show where the clothes were worn, somebody who do the set and the paintings, and all these areas kind of were converging somehow. And that happened, you know, during like those years, but happened before. And I think it happens today. I mean, today it's a little bit more complex somehow, because we are living in a very conceptual time where, you know, you have contemporary art and you have conceptual fashion designers, and you have appropriation in fashion and you have appropriation in contemporary art. Sure, it's a little bit complicated to see where all this appropriation converge to, but it is still like up to us as editors, as curators, to kind of connect these dots and try to communicate to our readers, to the visitor of museums, like what is behind, how, you know, basically there is kind of a thread that runs through contemporary culture.
So maybe then some philosophers in the 19th century were right to think that, you know, understanding fashion was understanding a little bit the mechanisms of history.
Unfortunately, though, we also inherited some very restrictive ideas of what constitutes art. And I remember the first time, I guess it was Ingrid Sishi on the cover of Art Forum, put in Issey Miyake. The idea that you would have a fashion design in an art publication was revolutionary. And even within my own institution, which has had a costume collection since 1946, it's been very hard to, I mean, by the 1980s, it had established its rationalization within that institution. But I remember that I read once that Philippe de Montebello, when he was discussing fashion versus all of the other arts in the institution, said, well, you know, an Aubusson chair cover for me has a higher status than a dress. And so even within the context of an art history that was moving in terms of its interpretation and encompassing of what constitutes fine art, a traditional institution like the Met was very slow in embracing it as an equal art.
But I can, you know, some of the fights that I had with fashion designers have been really on this point. I mean, when you talk with, I don't know, Miuccia Prada, and she says, no, I don't want to confuse my art collection with my fashion. They are two different things. One is the commercial side, and one is like my artistic expression, collecting, and that's a big mistake, because really, I think she is an artist in her own right, with an incredible kind of interior life, and you know, her clothes are like so complex in a certain way, and they have so many kind of aspects, and it's incredible. Or like when you talk with Tom Ford, and he says, finally, I'm creating something that is very artistic, like my movie, you know, the most recent one, A Single Man. I've been working for so many years, just, you know, basically like being a merchant. And then I think about, you know, the incredible contribution that he has brought to contemporary culture with what he did with Gucci in terms of not the clothes actually, but his advertising campaign, his communication, the way he changed, you know, the way people consider, I don't know, modernism in a certain way, or modern architecture, or modern design, or like sexuality. I mean, he made, you know, all that acceptable for the masses. When you think, you know, everybody thought that, I mean, everybody, a lot of people that I know, and I know a lot of ignorant people probably, they would think that he designed the Eames chairs, you know, just because he put them in his advertising. But think about the power of his advertising campaign, you know, like Eames had never been so popular in a certain way.
But that's part of the excitement of fashion, is that
the power of it.
As art has become more and more conceptually driven, it's appropriated a lot of the strategies of fashion, whether it's addressing gender or constructing a narrative around an artifact. So I think that it's becoming, as you said, much more complex, because there's a kind of erosion of the boundaries between.
Yeah, it is. But also because sometimes, I mean, we can say that fashion is a barometer of, you know, when things start to change. I mean, that's very interesting to, if you know, reflect upon this mechanism.
Because it's also much more ephemeral.
And
it has a faster
it contains already the signs of this, you know, even this, the crumbling of this, you know, hierarchies, and the communication, the power of communication, even you know, gender identities.
Power of money.
It's the power of money, of course, to be able to.
It's interesting that in the 1980s, one saw some of the leading lights of contemporary art really embrace fashion personally. Which you didn't see before. There was sort of, fashion was not serious, and so you were anti-fashion to be a serious artist. But in the 80s, there was this, and it's really post-Warhol, where you had this convergence of, you know, art is a business, and fashion was something in which you could take certain paradigms and apply to yourself. And, it became much more complicated then, I think.
Maybe we should go
Okay,
to the logo.
now I think that we would like to go behind the scene and ask Stefano, who totally redesigned W magazine, the process that led him to come to the new logo, and we have some examples here, and also we have some examples of cover tries, which is the first thing that you see in the newsstand, and I want to ask him on the creative process.
Well, I mean, it's kind of, unfortunately, it was a very brief process because we didn't have much time to make all these changes. What happened is that we were trying to redefine W, the magazine, and to kind of reposition the brand W and bring it into a new age. So the first step was really to work on the logo. And we took something that didn't change for 20 years. If you saw the beginning of this, so that was the original logo, has been the same more or less for more than 20 or 20, 30 years, was some kind of, you know, outline. So we went to something actually in a certain way very postmodern in terms of bringing back something that is very elegant. It's Benton actually, and then was redrawn by one of our head designers in the office, and he kind of created like this kind of handmade quality of the logo in terms of like connecting, you know, like the top of the W and making some part very skinny and some very thick. So it's playing with like proportions, the way kind of we do in fashion all the time. You know, we are still wearing the same jacket and pants, but suddenly every season the pants are skinnier or the larger, the jacket is shorter, it's longer, it's thinner, you know. So that was the exercise. And then we start playing with like where to put the logo and what kind of typefaces to work with. And really, we talked about putting like a frame around the image, a little bit like a 70s magazine in a certain way. Again, an exercise in postmodernism. You see like the one on the top. And then we tried something that was the full length, the full bleed. That is what we end up with. So really, like the bottom line of this exercise was to find a new face for W, something that would signal to our readers and to the community at large that this is a new magazine that wants to be more modern, more inclusive in a certain way, more updated, and it's a magazine that is about fashion, but is about many other things. That's why we call it like the word of style. And really, like, we also put on the logo these 5 W's. That is what we cover: the whys, the who's, the when, the where, and the what. So exactly, or starting with W. That is somehow is our philosophy and the structure of the magazine too. So
can you give us an example of the photo story?
Photo story. We can go through maybe some of the pages. This was like our first cover in September, and then.
I think that Matteo is ready to show us some examples.
Sure. This is like one of our stories shot by Merton Marcus. It's the stylist, the fashion director, that is Alex White on this shoot, was very much inspired by Edward Hopper, as you can see, and we created this kind of set somehow, and with a very modern take on photography, and that becomes like the set for this revival of kind of a very curvaceous, feminine fashion that was kind of the direction of many designers in the fall-winter collections. It's kind of hyper-realistic, but the play on colors, I think, is quite unbelievable. But again, you know, and if you look at the magazine, the back of the magazine, we have something that we call the back pages, and we kind of put together all the inspiration. So there is kind of some pictures of Scarlett Johansson in a movie. I can't remember the way she was acting like she had this part as a 50s movie star. Then you have Edward Hopper paintings and all of that.
But he has a very cinematographic quality.
Then here we go, something completely different. Is another story in the magazine. Here the list of references is quite unbelievable because it is exactly. There is Donna Jordan. There is like something like the advertising campaign that Oliviero Toscani did for Le Bambole, B&B Italia, a famous series of chairs by Mario Bellini. And then you will see when we get at the end of this story, we have like something, another story that was connected to this on Alessandro Mendini, that somehow has the same kind of palette and colors and kind of postmodern spirit that was at the base of like that shoot. So, okay. But the two, I mean, the two of a story kind of connects in terms of like, again, putting always fashion in the context of culture at large and creating a narrative, as you said, for the reader.
Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of the Costume Institute. You work with Diana Vreeland, you work with Richard Martin, now you are the driving force of this institution, and you just celebrated a very important acquisition with the Brooklyn Costume Institute.
I'll start with the most recent.
Yes.
What's happened in the last 2 years is the Brooklyn Museum has partnered with the Met and transferred their collection to us with the understanding that it's still the Brooklyn Museum collection in name, but that we would have full responsibility for its maintenance and presentation. And so that has expanded the collection by a full third. So we're very excited in that in the New York metropolitan area, we've become a kind of repository of two venerable collections. Ours, actually, the Costume Institute, as I said, started in 1946. The Brooklyn collection really began at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. And so it's a very wonderful combination in that their collection brings to us a kind of early 20th century representation. We have, frankly, Francophile collection, heavily haute couture, that marries really beautifully with their American-focused collection. So that's the present. In terms of where we sit in terms of a global representation, we have a very strong encyclopedic collection, but it's comparable, really. Every institution says they have the best, but it's comparable to what is at the Musée de la Mode in the Victoria and Albert. It's one of the world's great collections of fashionable dress. When I began as a graduate intern in the mid-1970s and interned as a student at the Costume Institute, I didn't realize that what that would lead to was a job working for Diana Vreeland. Diana Vreeland was not a curator per se. She was an editor. But what she did was bringing some of the skills of an editor to be able to tease out very strong stories out of a body of material to generate a level of excitement. Most of the people in this room are too young, but when I was growing up, if one saw costume, it was on a mannequin with naturalistic features, a wig, sometimes delaminating eyelashes, and it's sort of teetering with a teacup, because that was the mode of presentation. Mrs. Vreeland swept that out. She said, this is about historical pieces, but they have to be presented in a way that isn't alienating to the public. People who are interested in history think that history is prized in and of itself. She never assumed that, and it became clear to me once when I was at FIT, and we're holding a early 20th century dress, and the fire marshal came in, and he said, "That's beautiful." And I said, "Yeah, it's from 1900." It's still beautiful. And then you realize that what we share as academics and historians is a valuing of the past in a way that's not necessarily shared by everyone. So Mrs. Vreeland understood this, and so she merchandised history. Her approach was to take objects and look at what she was an elitist, and she felt that history was made not by popular groundswell or a kind of Marxian, dialectical thing. It was by charismatic individuals. So it was Peter the Great, it was Catherine the Great, it was Louis XIV. And because of that, she would superimpose these kinds of biographical, bigger than life historical figures onto her shows. And it transformed the way museum costume exhibitions were seen. She had numbers like 600,000 people would come to the museum to see her shows. It wasn't without controversy. I remember meeting Sir Roy Strong, who was at that point the head of the Victoria and Albert, and he dismissed her because her presentations were ahistorical. I remember as working for her that she didn't like corsets. when we dressed a Consuelo Vanderbilt dress, which had a monobosom, we dressed it properly. And she said, Consuelo would never have worn a corset. She was a modern woman. Well, so then it was put on a contemporary mannequin with a slouch and evacuated bust and, looking like that. And it looked like a beautiful thrift shop dress put on a young woman. It didn't look like Consuelo Vanderbilt. But the public came. I think that in the years that have, decades that have transpired, people like Richard Martin, who took a very conceptual approach to the interpretation of fashion, that the audience itself has become so sophisticated that though there is a nostalgia on the part of an earlier generation for Mrs. Vreeland's shows and all of this flashiness, if they were to see it, in fact, as she presented it, they would be upset. So what has happened internationally is I think there is an understanding that we can present things historically, but it has to be framed in ideas and modes of presentation using contemporary technology, multimedia, that we can still invest it with the kind of excitement and novelty that she did, but in a way that doesn't deny the actual facts of the historic period.
In fact, following these lines and sort of reconnecting with the ideas we were discussing before, the relationship between art, in popular culture and how fashion really situates itself between them. The last exhibition, the superheroes exhibitions, and perhaps we can see some
this
pictures
is American
here.
Woman.
We're going to show some different
The model is a muse, and also American Woman. So they all deal with popular culture and concepts. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Maybe it's my colleague Andrew Bolton and I think, share a fascination with high-low. I mean, we just do. Superheroes actually was generated by something very different, though, than what it ended up being. This is much more, I mean, Andrew is the curator of the show. It began with an idea that I had of garments that transformed, that imbued the body with superhuman characteristics. So the ability to penetrate space in a vacuum, the ability to shed bullets, the ability to walk through fire. That was my interest. And then, so we were using that as a stepping stone then to talk about metaphorical superheroes. As we started to discuss this with our colleagues, it became clear that they didn't feel that the Met was the appropriate venue for the show that I was conceiving, perhaps the Museum of Modern Art, perhaps the Cooper Hewitt, but at the Met, we're about extraordinary artistic expressions. So it's less about the technology. I mean, one can argue this, but that was their position, and it had a resonance with me. And Andrew was really, as somebody from the UK, I don't know how many of you have read the Michael Chabon book about people who are two men who are writing, creating superhero characters at the end of the Second World War. He was, as somebody outside of our culture, absolutely engaged by this phenomenon in America of the superhero, and something that seems to be very exportable as an idea. So that's how the show began. So high-low wasn't necessarily how we started, but it ended up being something about...
But also being able to communicate more effectively, I think, with the audience on the basis of this interaction.
And it was, and I participated in the vernissage and in thinking of ways in which it would be presented. But the real attraction to the superhero as a mechanism for fashion designers to present another kind of metaphor, that was really Andrew. With Model as Muse, that also came out of a very different place. This is Florida.
Oh,
there's...
We have to maybe go...
This is Florida. That was one of our more traditional. This is Model as Muse.
Yes. Go back.
Mark Jacobson. Charles
magazines.
James.
We wanted to, Stop here.
Stop here. With Dovima
yeah.
and the elephant.
Andrew and I were both fascinated by the phenomenon in the post-war period of fashion models becoming these ideal beauties that every woman in contemporary culture would try to emulate, that they would be, whether it was Susie Parker or Dovima, that you would fixate on one or the other of these very different templates of beauty and try to refine your own look to conform with them. For me, it was an opportunity to show the Costume Institute's very rich collection of ephemera. We have this wonderful range of fashion publications, and I thought, you know, we're about costume, but I can then show this particular collection together with, because of the richness of our post-World War II collection of haute couture, I could juxtapose it with the actual dresses. And so that's how this particular thing started. So the high-low thing, or well, the ephemera, because I don't think Vogue in the 1960s is necessarily low. It was a very elitist
Sophisticated,
enterprise.
but well, it was still like magazine.
Right.
It's pop
It's
culture.
It was like a cultural, you know,
Yeah.
you'd open it and then you'd see Avedon portraits of Nuria, you know, his foot and whatever. So, so it was a way of taking two different mediums and putting them together in a way that we thought was compelling. Also, we are not a collection that necessarily has as its mission social or cultural history. It's really about the advance of an aesthetic project. So it was a way for us to at least address slightly cultural conditions over time.
Stefano, I would like to ask you something about the new muses today. I mean, are models still muses, or the celebrities are the new muses? And
Well, I cannot say that celebrities are the new muses. I would say they are probably advertising posters more than muses, but and they're paid for that much more than any other muses ever. But I mean, to have celebrities, I mean, or I think there is like this kind of dialectic relationship between ideal and reality in terms of like after years of idealizing models and putting clothes on women that were like the most perfect representation of the human body, somehow there was a certain kind of tiredness, and we started like working as magazines with like actresses, because there was something more than just the body. There was also a brain or a persona or something. And then the phenomenon became even larger than ever, because people start like recognizing themselves in actors and celebrities more than in models. I mean, there is always, it's all about this process of identification between, you know, like women or men and the representation that you have, the idealized representation. A lot of what happened, we cannot forget, happened because thanks to digital technology, we have been able to transform what is reality into a form of fake reality that is closer to, so you have, you know, an actress or an actor that is very different on the cover magazine than in the reality of, I mean, it's kind of closer to what he or she is in a movie that is, again, a role that is playing or she is playing. So when we say, like, you know, celebrities are the return to reality, I would say stop in that sense. But for sure, the process of identification is much more complicated. That's why somehow model for what they are not working anymore. There are models that work better than others because they have a series of layers. Somehow a model works when she is like Marilyn Monroe. Then you are thinking about Marilyn Monroe, you're not thinking about that model, you know, playing the role of a model. So it's all about layers somehow.
what do you think?
I'm going to give an anecdote about our party of the year. One of the things that's so extraordinary about a mixture of celebrities and fashion models is you realize fashion models are professional in fashion. And so they really know how to wear clothes. They also have an almost alien kind of physicality. They don't look like the rest of us. And it allows them to carry clothes in a way that is really poetic and transportive. So when you have a party where you have fashion models and celebrities, primarily music industry or film people, the film people are like that Gloria Swanson line. You know, they're all about the head. You see their heads and you think, oh my God, you know, it's
She was in that film.
right. You know, oh, it's Penelope. Oh, it's Rafe. You know.
Yeah, you don't see the person, you
don't
see
but you
the
see
part,
this
the role.
very strong character. But what makes the environment sexy and otherworldly, it's the models. This, I don't think, translates very much any longer to publications, in that there has been a transformation of what we as the public want of our ideals. We want some sense that they're accessible. If you think about celebrities in the 1930s and 1940s, the studios really structured our impression of them. So they were really idealized and we followed them. Today, we love the fact that we're standing in Grand Union and we see, you know, somebody looking hideous in their jogging clothes, but then looking fabulous on the red carpet. Somehow it becomes the glamour in that transformation is something we can identify with.
Right.
And a model doesn't do that. She looks great even without makeup.
I mean, and then you have really like how the market has driven like the celebrities to be so relevant to business at this point. You know, I think we had a story that was actually very controversial in the New York Times Sunday magazine when we were like, it was a story on Rachel Zoe, the stylist and the icon maker, and she said that when she puts a dress on one of her girls that are, you know, kind of B or C series, usually kind of actresses, she sells many more of them than any dress put on a model in the pages of Vogue. That made, you know, Anna Wintour furious, from what I know.
It was not very nice of her.
But it is very true. It is very true. I mean, that's why, you know, magazine had to kind of conform, you know, in a certain way. The thing that I'm trying to do, and I think I'm not the only one, is that you are trying to use a kind of a pop icon, an actress, and, you know, like in the issue that I think you look at, we have Kim Kardashian. You think, my God, how low can you go? But at the end, it's not Kim Kardashian really. It is Barbara Kruger talking about like what pop culture is. So it's about the magazine to use, I would say, pop culture, or to use like somebody like Kim Kardashian, or like, you know, next issue is I have Katherine Heigl with her adopted Korean girl, daughter, that actually send the message. I mean, it's about what the magazine is communicating, and at the end, the celebrity become just the way to communicate it to a larger audience. I mean, if I get you to look into that issue, if I get somebody to buy that issue because there is a Kim Kardashian, it's about curiosity, I think. And that's my job, to kind of bring you in, and then, you know, you can discover something that you maybe didn't know that you were interested in.
That's exactly what you do in a museum as well, is that you're not driven by a turnstile, but you know that to educate or to disseminate an idea, people have to come in. And so if it's something that's so inert as an experience that you're sending out that it doesn't create a kind of curiosity to get off the sofa, get on the subway and come to the museum, you're failing on some level, because you're investing so much effort in terms of putting together the project, that you want people to see it.
And you have to become kind of bolder and bolder somehow, you know, like I understand the idea of the superhero. If you call a show the superhero, sure, you are going to attract a larger audience. Sure, you're going to get some people that you don't want, but you are going to get people that actually didn't know they were interested in, let's say, fashion, but they come to, you know, because the kids want to see the superhero. But at the end, you get actually like the attention of an audience that would not have been.
It was a lot of men and a lot of kids. I went to more cocktail parties where women said, I saw it, it was lovely, but I'm not recommending to my friends. It was just not our normal audience.
Yeah.
You know, but we made it up because a child, as it turns out, has his nanny come, has his mother come, and then forces his father to see it again. They're repeat visitors. So it had a very successful show.
To both of you, what are the factors that influence fashion today, and what kind of role you think, you know, magazine and museum have on that, you know, sense of creativity or design? Is there any relationship?
I think it's very oblique in terms of a museum, that where we might exercise some influence is that all the great designers, the most creative designers, are open to all kinds of things in the culture. And so it's likely that if they're stopping in New York, they're going to go to art exhibitions as well as the Costume Institute shows. They're going to see everything. And so in that sense, I think maybe there's some influence. But in terms of the general public, I don't think you go to an exhibition and, well, I can think of one exception, but you don't generally go to an exhibition with the idea that it's going to give you a strategy of style. I don't think that that's...
So it's more for design.
But we did have a show that was, which was aberrational for us in that it looked at the wardrobe of a living individual, Iris Apfel, who is a kind of haute bohemian, and she goes to thrift shops and flea markets, but she also used to go to couturiers at the end of the season and buy what was left. But she would collage these ensembles together in a very American way. It wasn't like on a Piaget.
Yes,
it wasn't, you know, like Izzy. It was just a very American way in that there was a kind of more, I would say, linear aesthetic, a two-dimensional aesthetic of color and, you know, certain kinds of rules that she conforms to. And that had a great impact, I think, on a number of people, because a lot of women will come up to me and says, I was so inspired by that show, and it meant they bought a red jacket as opposed to a navy blue or black jacket. But still, for them, it was such a liberating experience. But that's not generally why people come to the museum exhibition.
In terms of inspirations that we, I think like for a magazine today, what is the most of our inspiration, they come from, I would say, contemporary art, because somehow I really believe that artists, because they have so much time in their hand, they can go deeper, they can do much more research and really like come up with original kind of way of looking at the past and the present. And so much of what we do is inspired by contemporary art, and I'm very always stimulated by their work in terms of like research and images and words and the way of thinking, because so many times they just kind of artists are able to without even trying to understand and communicate something that is beyond words and beyond images, kind of a mood somehow. So contemporary art, and sure, like films and movies, and absolutely like television, that I think today is very often better than movies, as it is kind of a little bit like what niche movies used to be. You know, now you have niche channels with cables, so shows, yeah. So a little bit of all of that at the same time.
What kind of relationship do you see, both of you, between fashion and style? Is there any contradiction?
I have a cat thing, but it's just so like
I
bland.
I don't know. I hate when people talk about style as something that is there and doesn't move and is this kind of is the opposite of fashion. Fashion changes all the time and style is always the same. It's like it's timeless. I think that's kind of a big stupid lie.
But they are I mean, they are very abused words.
Well, I think that fashion is
fact,
something
the
that
fact,
is
so-
constantly changing, whereas style is not necessarily not changing. And I'll give you an example. We used to have a woman at FIT who was in her late 70s, and Claude Montana did his first Lanvin couture show. And he introduced in it sort of 60s colors like this aqua, double face, fabric, cashmere, and this asymmetrical hem. It came out in women's wear. Here's this woman who was very stylish, but in her 70s, volunteering at FIT. She came to one of our openings a week later, and she was wearing a skirt that looked like the Montana. And I said, Rose, how did you get this? And she still looked like Rose. But I said, how did you get, a 70-year-old wearing something that looks like the most contemporary haute couture? And she said, it's actually Pierre Cardin from 1969. So it was a sort of maxi length. She had rolled it up at the waist. She had a big safety pin because, when you roll it, it's wider. So she had safety pinned it. So she had done this to make, and to me, that's style, that she's conforming to the prevailing aesthetic. Because you really can't be stylish if you don't have some acknowledgement of what the contemporary eye is.
Absolutely.
So
There is
it's-
no
it's-
style,
that is-
timeless style. No.
Yeah, it's
You're just
not, because
boring.
even if you look classic, you've done something so that to the contemporary person, it's updated. And to me, that's style. That you're looking at the whole world, you're living in a very contemporary spirit, but you're being true to yourself. I think that's
Yeah.
what
That's
it is.
good.
Yeah,
That's good.
but in a way, I mean,
Fashion really transforms
I
your
am also
eye.
a professor of literature. Of course, to me, style also means form.
Right.
When you want to identify a certain author, so I guess it's a similar.
Well,
what
but
describe-
you can talk about style as something that is consistent over time, but it doesn't mean that the
Yes.
form is fixed over time. We did a show on
Yes.
Tina Chow, and Tina had collected haute couture in the 20th century, but all kinds of Madame Grey, Balenciaga, Cardin, Ungaro, everyone. A Dior, she had a Dior. When people came into the exhibition, because she had a model's physique, we put it all on what is called a schleppy mannequin. It's done in Switzerland. It's a very abstract mannequin. You see it in Bergdorf's uses it. Barney's uses it. So it was a standard mannequin. And people came in and said, you captured Tina. You really captured Tina. How did you find a mannequin that looked like Tina? It was Tina's eye. It was the editorial eye. No matter what period or what designer, somehow she picked the thing that looked like her.
But she was the most fashionable person
Right.
season by
And
season.
I mean, and I think
that's
it's sort of interesting that when asked who is a muse now, it's very difficult to say because I think the process has changed. It's no longer about Dior having a woman who's a woman of a certain age, but a kind of chic, but is not photogenic in his atelier, inspiring him to a way of dressing. That doesn't. That's unless you're. I mean, I can think of different people who ostensibly function as that within a couture house, but it's not really true. The designer is really working on his or her own, and
It's a constant change.
Transformation.
Maybe transformation would be the right
In
word.
this context, can we still talk about European, Italian style versus American style?
Well, I think we used to. I think less and less because, in that sense, you have American designer designing for French labels. You have, Italian designer, designing for French label, and in Italy you have, you know, Americans. You had, you know, Tom Ford probably designing the most well-known Italian brand, like with Gucci and all of that. So no, I think you have kind of but at the same time, I would say fashion can be very local still today. So you have this global and this local, more than like Italian. I mean, I think sometimes there is, you know, in Italy you have a very specific, like Milanese style, you have kind of a Venetian style, you have a Roman style. And, you know, the same way, you know, in the States you have so many kind of...
New York versus California or Los Angeles.
Texas.
So it's... In that sense, we live in this kind of with these two extremes. On one side, you know, exactly the very local kind of influences, and on the other side, this kind of globalization, because, you know, certain things are happening everywhere, especially like with the very young people. You know, the sneakers are the same, and like T-shirts and
I think one of the ways
duffel
to
coat.
test this principle is, because I took a cab down Fifth Avenue, and if you looked at people walking on the street, and mostly it's tourists, you don't know where they're from. But, you know, back even in the early 80s, if you went to Paris, you knew the Germans, you knew the Americans, you knew the British. That's become much more homogenous.
Yeah.
Everyone's dressing for comfort.
I think
and for informality. Where I do think it's a difference is when you look at some of the style blogs, and you look at the people who are really engaged in issues of fashion, I mean, are personally committed and engaged, that when you look at the Italians, they're extraordinary. The French are chic, but chic with a sense of artifice. I'm digging a hole, but you know, with the Italian, with the Italian, there's this there's this sense of spezzatura where it's, you know, where it's about looking elegant, but in a way that is not artificial. So a kind of easy sensuality comes across about the fabrics and about the drape and the fit, even if it's tight. There's a kind of softness.
I think
the French is more about crispness and sexuality.
Absolutely. I think it's very much about the attitude and like what kind of education or kind of environment you live in. So you have a certain kind of, let's call it leading class or working class, or like educated class that have the same characters throughout the world. I mean, at this point, everywhere. I mean, with the same kind of, they have the same bags or the same shoe. I mean, it happens so much. At the same time, you have this kind of attitude that can become really, really local. I mean, the way, you know, Italians would wear like down jackets and make it in such a stereotype of something is really incredible.
The diplomat, the book of the courtier, Castiglione, he had a word for what you just described. He said sprezzatura, so you look natural, but you don't show that you have worked on it.
But you have thought about it. It's calculated, but it's not.
That's what he said. So to me, it's a quintessential. I mean, really, he was really talking about style there. But
and you see it more in the men. But you know, when you're in Milan and you see what I would consider like a 16 arrondissement woman, or what might be a British upper class woman, and she's wearing an Austrian Loden coat and you know a tweed jacket and a gray flannel skirt. They're all the same things, but there's something sensual about the way, and that's about attitude. It isn't as if the components are different, because they're all working with this bourgeois, haute bourgeois vocabulary, but it's about how it's worn, whether or not the coat is over the shoulders or if the arms are over the sleeve. You know, it's playing with fashion in a very different
but that's why I think it's so important to understand how fashion is connected to culture, and it's not just clothing, but it's behavior, it's gesture, manners.
I was in St. Petersburg a few years ago and went to a high school graduation. I was taken by my guide to this graduation. And there were these young, it was a privileged high school, and there were these, part of the ceremony of graduation is all the younger students celebrate the older students by doing this performance. And so there were these young girls, 11 to 14, who were celebrating. So they were just wearing simple dresses, but when they were standing at the doorway, they had these attitudes that were like 19th century ballerinas, where they were like not a way that an American girl would stand. And you just saw a continuation, even with the Bolsheviks and the Marxists and, you know, the Stalinists, that somehow there was this idea about your body that was this kind of romantic 19th century, and I think that's culture.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. I guess
Last two
last
two questions, and now
continuing,
you can project the Mendini story.
Italy was very present, I think, in September issue somehow. And of course, one of the most interesting maestri, Alessandro Mendini, and the title Made in Italy, which I think you deconstructing with this sort of. So if you could talk about it.
Why? Well, you know, Mendini going back to Damos was like such a big news, and also we were very fascinated by an exhibition that he put up at the Triennale in Milan. He kind of recreated like the connection, the things that he really loves, and how he could describe through like kind of how he could tell the story of Italian design through his eyes. And he picked like specific pieces of from the Triennale archives, and he just opposed them to a lot of objects that were completely disconnected from design, like paintings and clothes and pop items. And it was a little bit like really like a trip inside his mind. And we wanted this in the issue because we thought that now that we talk so much about like all these like kind of postmodernism, we wanted to go back to the person that was maybe, you know, the mind behind, you know, postmodernism and all those theories. And somehow we also wanted to celebrate the certain joy in color, in attitude that somehow has been missed in fashion, and something that we wanted to, we saw very present in some of the spring summer collection, and you know, kind of to just oppose these with like the pictures that you have seen before of Lara Stone and these colorful clothes. It was really part of this package where we connected fashion and somehow Marc Jacobs and Mendini and a lot of other elements that we see happening in culture at large.
Talking about Marc Jacobs, there is a name that was absolutely magically resurrected from all the reviews when Marc Jacobs did the last show in September. One of the major sources of inspiration of that show, and the name that was hugely forgotten, resurrected, was Walter Albini, who was another great fashion designer, and Stefano just wrote a book about him. And this guy was extremely influential, not only because now everybody maybe can hear this name because of Marc Jacobs, but because he really was.
Well, he was probably the most, the first Italian designer to establish a pret-a-porter brand. Doesn't mean that, you know, he was the first in the world. There were like a lot of boutique products and ready-to-wear that was made in Florence by different designers, the Missoni, for example. Or you had like Saint Laurent that already was working on the Rive Gauche. He was the one that created like, that brought, like I would say, fashion outside of the atelier and really into the industry, and made it into the industry, into the factories. What he did, he connected all the products that he was designing. I'm talking about shirts and knitwear and coats and under one name that was his name, so it became like Walter Albini, W.A. He created a logo. Actually, he created many logos, and he evolved this logo. He had a very brief career. He never found really like a business partner the way, I don't know, Valentino found in Giammetti or Mr. Berger was for Yves Saint Laurent. So his career was like very brief and very insecure somehow, but he put down really like all the most important like seeds of what Italian pret-a-porter would become. He was incredibly influential to the work of Mr. Armani, and after that to Gianni Versace, in terms of like really, and it was always about a total look. Not only his drawings that are incredible, have every single detail from the shoes to the belt, the brooches, the hair, the makeup, everything has to be part of his drawings, and then became part of his looks. But also he's the kind of guy that went, the advertising campaign has to be exactly control and to completely mirror like his drawings, and then his house has to be exactly the same interiors. He changed like 5, 6 houses, and every time his interiors were part basically of the movie that he was living in. And you know, by many was identified, was signaled as like the Italian Yves Saint Laurent or the Italian Karl Lagerfeld. That was his generation. His first show was in 1971 in Milan, and no, 1973. He died in 1983, actually.
Only 10 years.
Yeah.
Was really. What do you think about him? What is the influence that you see of Walter Albini in
Well, I think
the 70s and actually also? Yeah.
I think from a historical standpoint, what is so influential about him is he introduces to a European city, Milan, a kind of attitude about dressing which shrugs off the prior Italian sensibility, which is a little bit overwrought. I mean, it's like what happened in France, where once you introduce pret-a-porter, it has to be more relaxed. I think there's a greater affinity of Italians to an American sensibility of pragmatism and a sort of sportswear attitude. So he's the first, I think, to really endorse that kind of easiness of structure. You know, it could be a drawstring or an elastic waistband. It didn't have to be the structured thing that even the most avant-garde Italian designers weren't really embracing. If you look at Italian Vogues in that period, I mean, just before Albini, pre-Albini, you know, it was mostly about the advertising, and the advertising was very
Structure.
dressy. I mean, it's dressy. And he brought in a kind of freshness. And I think his importance is really, he establishes a position for Milan to make it a much more contemporary response to the in the fashion system.
Thank you very much. I think